the Greek mythology that a lot of the Jungian analysts built their fundamental worldview on was not saying that all of these forces live inside an individual's head. So, the appropriation of Greek mythology into the psychology world carries with it implications. And it's a beautiful way of starting to understand some of those forces that do, you could say, live within us.
Yeah.
But that was not by any means the full picture. The full picture is that we live in a world of forces, and we're surrounded by forces, and there are internal forces and external forces, and not every single thing that happens in the world is a reflection of us.
Welcome back to the transmission, my friends. That deeper purpose you're looking for, that felt sense of embodied soul, you push that down. You ignore that, unless you can't. Then I guess it's time to go see a therapist. That pretty much is the default way that modernity treats our need for deep belonging, for spiritual purpose and catharsis. Of course, I'm strawmanning and oversimplifying, and don't get me wrong, of course, taking your mental health seriously is of the utmost importance, but is that really all we're searching for? I know that I'm looking for something more. I know that I'm looking for something that can't be fully captured in that psychological, pathological paradigm. I suspect that's true for many of you, and I know it is for our guest in this one, Josh Schrei, because for one, he's got a soul-stirring, incredibly well-executed podcast called The Emerald, and there's a particular episode of said podcast called The Revolution Will Not Be Psychologized that really drives this point home. Again, this idea that psychology, pathology, and therapy speak has infiltrated every segment of reality, but especially spirituality, to a point where we completely conflate psychology and spirituality. I do think it's important to note that, of course, psychology is not a monolith. There's a massive chasm between Jungian depth psychology and behaviorism, but I shall resist the urge to go on a rambling side quest on that point, because we do investigate it rather thoroughly in this mind meld, along with many other angles of the pulsing mystery that cannot be named. So much more I could say about Josh Schrei. I will say he's a writer, teacher, lifelong student of world mythology and spirituality. All the links you will need for Josh and his podcast are in the description. Same for Third Eye Drops. On the note of this media vessel, my friends, won't you nourish it by tickling the algorithm with a like, a sub, a comment, a share? It is all of the utmost importance. It is all part of the core nutrition we require. I must also remind you, we've got over 300 other mind melds that will never be published here on YouTube. You can only hear them on podcast platforms. So do look up Third Eye Drops and subscribe wherever you listen to pods. And would you like to initiate yourself deeper into the mysteries of whatever this is? Then join me and hundreds of other Wonder Dippers over at patreon.com/Third Eye Drops. It's the best way to support the show. You'll get to join the community. We've got a patron-only Discord server. We do monthly Zoom hangs, a book club, and more. And you get rewards at patreon.com/Third Eye Drops. And with that, my friends, let us meld minds with Josh Schrei. The Emerald, man, it's like this cathartic, heart-hitting, mythopoetic kind of smack over the head that shakes you out of these like beige daily doldrums that we all are coerced into living in. And it's so rare to come across media like that, that wants to shake you out of the egoic illusions that you're forced to spend so much time in. So first, thank you as a listener.
Thank you, and thanks for having me here. And yeah, I just am trying to do my little part to counteract what you could call the numbness of modernity, the numbness that modernity tries to require of us. And I think in counteracting that numbness, it's important to explore art forms that shake us awake to a primal experience of being. And some of the art forms that have been around for a while now, can get a little stuck in how they approach that process. So we constantly need to be reinvigorating and renewing and exploring new ways that art can do this.
Absolutely, man. And to just ask a selfish question right off the bat, like you and I are both in this kind of creative hamster wheel to that point that you just made. How do you continually keep the glimmer? Or do you just sort of have to like commit to the process, sort of Stephen Pressfield style, and like sit down and evoke the muse and hope for the best?
Mm. This has been a process throughout my entire life, and it took me a long while to get to a place where there's what you could call kind of a continuous steady flow. And the heart of it for me was the I would say, deep embodied recognition that I'm not creating anything at all, and
Mm,
that art is all around us, and the universe is pouring with that glimmer that you're talking about. And there's no shortage of inspiration in the universe, and there's no shortage of creative outflow, and it's constant. And like so many mythic traditions have pointed us to, it's happening all the time. And there's what you could call an eternal well that gushes forth constantly. And what we need to do as artists is to start to really look at what attunements we need to make in our lives in order for it to pour through. That's like
yeah.
the heart of it. But I think a lot of the issue that people get into with kind of, connection to that glimmer, is that they, like everything else in the modern world, they take it on themselves, and they're the individual artist, and they have to produce, and it's all coming from them, and it's a statement of their self-worth, and it's like all of these things, right? And actually it's none of these things, right? It's
Mm,
traditionally, it's not any of these things. It's a repurposing or refracting a prism on something that exists and is there and is always around us. And our role, my role, is to look at what it means to be the best prism possible. So, in the midst of a world that demands numbness on one hand and is deeply agitated on the other hand,
mhm,
for
mhm.
me, that connection that you're talking about, connection to the glimmer, it's what replenishes and renews and saves my life. And I'll spend as much time there as I possibly can.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well said. And even selfishly, even if I'm not feeling the glimmer primarily egoically, I'd rather prostrate myself creatively to that thing and
Mm,
go for it, even if I'm not feeling it, because that's one of the inevitable things. I'm sure you've had this over the years. Like, you've been consistent, you've got yourself an audience. So inevitably, that's going to lead to people asking you for advice, asking you how to start a creative project or whatever. And to be completely honest, I'm not really sure how I've done it other
mm,
than to sort of approach it in that kind of a way, in that we all have to do something. And there is this sort of unrequited cathartic thirst we have for something deeper to serve something bigger. And it's one of those things where, as badly as we want it, we're not quite sure how to satiate that a lot of the time. So I think a lot of people who feel that strongly stumble into some form of creative expression as a
mm,
way to sort of like obliquely try to address the unaddressable or something.
mm,
And I find myself in that kind of space a lot. And it really feels like these dialogues and exploring the ideas that orbit these dialogues is at least a serviceable way of doing that. So, my only real creative advice ever is like find something that does that for you. And I don't
Mm.
really know how I'm going to turn this into a question for you, but is that how it is that perhaps what led to you creating the Emerald? Was it something like that?
Yeah, I mean, there were a few threads at play, and the mythic storytelling thread had been with me in my life from the time I was born, and I was born into a family that in which you could call like animate what you could call animate story was very present,
Mm.
and grew up. We lived in India, and I grew up steeped in the mythic, and so there's that thread, and then there was a thread of music and writing and spoken word and this kind of thing, which has been with me from a very early age too. Um, and the Emerald, I think, came out of a recognition and a feeling that the old forms of storytelling, the oral forms of storytelling, the bardic storytelling with
Mm.
accompaniment to music, that ability of the storyteller through sound vibration specifically to be able to conjure and transport and take people on a journey, that was being lost with literacy and literary analysis, and that a lot of the heart of the myths. You mentioned that you're a fan of James Hillman, and Hillman has talked about this at length, but a lot of the heart of the story, the life breath of the story, was getting lost.
Mm.
And even attempts to recapture it, like when you hear an audiobook that uses music or something like this, attempts to recapture it were still fundamentally in literary terms, not in what you could call bardic terms. And so I saw, in particular area of interest of mine and the mythologies of India and Eastern spirituality and this type of thing, I saw a lot of things emerging from the scholarly perspective that were really beautiful and really helpful. But, you know, if we're going to understand the power of story and understand the mythic, we have to understand that this is something living that's
Yeah.
transmitted. And often the way it's transmitted is through sound. And it's not done justice through simply literary analysis.
Right.
And in our world these days, I think we face a host of problems that come from the fact that all of these ideas and thoughts remain abstracted, and we've lost what you could call a basic connection to a living, breathing cosmos. And story as a portal to open up our connection to that shine, that glimmer that you're talking about. So what
Mm.
led me to the Emerald was a lot of trial and error, and like a lot of the story of an artist trying to like find his way, and like, you know, tried to force myself into the kind of writer mode for quite a while, and then realized that what I was writing was all meant to be spoken aloud. Like
Mm.
it had the cadence of something that was meant to be spoken aloud. And so it took trial and error, and it took rejection, and it took like some lows
Mm.
along the artistic journey for me to start to realize, like, and I think this is kind of hopefully helpful for people out there. There's a lot of syncretic artists out there. There's a lot of people who have a lot of different threads that they're weaving, a lot of different interests, and the whole like, should I be an artist, should I be a writer, should I be a visual artist, should I be whatever it is. I think it's a time when we need to let go of some of those boundaries a little bit. And, the medium of podcasting, for example, allows for as much, it's a blank canvas. It allows for as much exploration as we want to do. And I was having a conversation about this the other day with a friend who's kind of, working in their life to figure out how to weave varying strands together. And you know the tried and true art forms, like I go to the example of rock and roll a lot. Like when rock and roll arrived, you know people were passing out, and it was like
Yeah.
seriously altering people's consciousness and taking them into realms that they've never experienced before, and transporting in that old bardic sense. And it was doing this for very clear reasons. It was accompanied with a 4/4 beat, which is a you know, traditional trance induction beat. And
Yeah.
it really had a profound impact on the body of culture. now fast forward, 50, 60 years or whatever it is, and rock and roll is like background shopping music in Target, right? And its transportive ability has changed a little bit. It's not as
Hmm.
present as it was. So I think, in an era that is asking us to wake up from a little bit of numbness and inertia, I think we need to be fresh with our art forms and find those art forms that connect us to this basic experience of waking up to the animate, of allowing the life breath to move through the transportive ability of art. And the question, like, what's going to do that in this day and age? What's
Yeah.
really going to transport in this day and age? That's like a question that I would pose back to artists to really feel into.
Yeah, man. And it's so elusive because, well, first of all, everything you said, I can feel it pulsating throughout what you do. The influence of Eastern mysticism and animism and shamanism and things, you haven't even mentioned, as well as people like Hillman, like Jung, which I'm sure we'll get into.
Mm.
Um, like I mentioned to you that episode of yours, the revolution will not be psychologized, was just like, it's so good for so many reasons. But um, that thing, that glimmer, is always elusive, and trying to capture it or even find it for yourself in a way that's really animating is just always challenging because it's not as simple as immersing yourself necessarily in some traditional mode of being. Like for some people that works, right? Like, just throwing yourself into the like a shamanistic tradition, or becoming a Buddhist, becoming some kind of deep yogi. Yet at the same time, we are kind of stuck in this postmodern POV, whether we like it or not. And I'm not just saying this in a pejorative, like, Jordan, well, postmodernist kind of way where you're stuck, looking at everything in these abstract ways. It's like we can't help but be, because of our education, our upbringing, are not like, just going to college kind of forces you into that point of view, because you are learning about different cultures. You are, maybe learning about the history of Western thought. Like, for God's sake, I just read Passion of the Western Mind by Tarnas, which is like this
Mm.
sprawling history of ideas, right? And you can't come away from absorbing that much knowledge with some notion of like that there's some best way to be, there's some best way to think, there's some truest spirituality or science or whatever. So we're left in this like kerfuffle of ideas, and you just sort of have to cobble together something that feels real for you, given the preponderance of evidence. And I can tell that you're of a similar mind, that you have all these different influences, that you're captured by a lot of different ways of thought. But what is it for you that really helps you sink into it? Is there a personal practice, or is it always kind of under construction for you?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm kind of a interesting case in that I've had a very syncretic upbringing,
Yeah.
and syncretism is a word I'm going to use a lot in the response to this question. So, syncretism, I'm assuming people are familiar, means the blending of lots of different influences and traditions, and cultural gumbo, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Um, I've had a very syncretic life. Um, I've studied a lot of different traditions and lived in a lot of different places. But then within that also, I've deepened into practice traditions and studied in specific lineages and practiced in specific lineages for many years at a time. And I think that balance is interesting. Um, like you said, I don't think everybody is going to immediately drop everything and find a lineage practice and devote the rest of their lives to it in these times, right? It's just not the nature of the times we're living in. Some people will, and that can be really beautiful. I always recommend when people are saying, what in this postmodern soup do I do? I always recommend practice in lineage for
Hmm.
a while, like deepen into lineage, even if it's not the perfect lineage. you know, even if it doesn't exactly match your kind of neo-animist postmodern,
Yeah, right.
whatever.
Yeah.
Like, and a lot of times people get caught in this because they think that any lineage they find has to be the perfect lineage and has to match exactly how they see the world. And part of the thing that part of the place where lineage works the most effectively is that we don't agree with everything in that lineage, and we rub up against it and have frictions, and those frictions invite us to return to practice again, and that's a beautiful alchemical process. So I think deepening in our culture is important, and then at the same time I think that um, I'm doing a whole episode on this. It's actually the next episode about syncretism, and it's tentatively titled "Let Us Sing of the Syncretic Gods of Exiles and Wanderers." And it's about how we live in syncretic times, and there's going to be influences, and it's going to be a mishmash, and there's shame around that in our
Yeah.
culture, especially with a lot of discourse around cultural appropriation. There's shame around like this kind of, oh, well, I have, Kali next to Mother Mary on my altar and this kind of thing.
Hmm.
And there needn't be any shame around this at all. We live in syncretic times, and traditions are going to reflect that. And there are places in the world, and Brazil, where I've done some study, is a great example of a place where syncretism is celebrated. Syncretism is honored. Like, you look at the animist traditions down there, and there are new traditions arising all the time. Spiritist traditions arising all the time. And on any given altar, you are going to find African influences and Christian influences and native influences. And this is all part of what you could call a spiritual animist response mechanism to the fact that we are fractured. We
Hmm.
can't, there's a couple of ways to deal with the fact that we're fractured, right? And when I say we, um, I'm really ultimately talking about most people on Earth. Like, most people on Earth have experienced some type of fracture from their traditional lineage. It has varying degrees, of course, and for some populations that fracture happened a long time ago, and for some it happened more recently, and for some, it's in the process of happening. Really, for all of us in the modern world in ways. So recognizing that there is fracture, there's a couple of ways we can approach it. One is to try to heal that fracture,
Yeah.
right? To mend that fracture, which can seem like a beautiful endeavor, and then some days can seem like an incredibly frustrating endeavor, and can seem like, where do I even start? And you know, the wound is so deep, and the distance is so great, and does my
Yeah.
little shrine with Kali and the Mother Mary, does it even start to cut it? Does it even start to address this, you know, this fracture that I feel within my own lineage? There's familial fracture that adds to that, right?
Yeah.
There's the fracture of migrations to lands that aren't traditionally ours. So there's a way that we can work with this fracture by attempting to mend it and anchor into lineage and anchor into place, and really deeply start to, you could say, recalibrate our relationship with simple foundations of where we are, and what the local ecological forces are, and how to be in ongoing relation with them. And this is something, that I explore personally and through the courses I teach and this kind of thing. Um, but then also there's an overarching picture in which, like, you know it's important to recognize the fracture, and sometimes the practice is to sing of the fracture.
Mm.
Sometimes the practice is to say, yeah, I am spiritually orphaned and exiled, and all I carry with me are the songs that are in my heart, and I don't have a full blown lineage. um, And this is something that, like, you could say, exiles and wanderers have had to do for generations and generations.
Yeah.
And there's also a power in that. There's a power in the songs of place, you could say, and there's a power in the songs that say, my homeland is far away.
Yeah.
because my homeland is far away. No matter how deeply embedded the culture, no matter how deeply embedded in land, there is a human experience of separateness, of otherness that defines
Yes.
what it is to be a human being, even in those place-based cultures, right? And so to recognize that separation and to not feel that we are other because we feel separation, because I guarantee you, if I ask the question, how many feel separate now, or how
Yeah.
many have felt separate in their lives before, everyone is going to say,
Oh
oh, yeah,
yeah.
at times I've felt separate. You know, so honoring that, understanding that it's a huge part of the story, and understanding that there's a potency to that experience too, and that there's a potency to the songs that say, you know, life is hard and my homeland is far away. And you
Yeah.
can see this in blues music, and you can see it in devotional hymns and in the devotional poets of India. And it's this understanding of, you know, not everybody has the 10,000-year relationship with the single grove, and in the absence of that, yes, we can recalibrate our relationship with place. And we also have to maybe unburden ourselves of a little bit of the shame of being spiritual orphans, of being exiles, of being wanderers, um,
Yeah.
because every human heart carries with it the capacity to connect,
Yeah.
right? No
Yeah.
matter how far you're cast from your place of origin, every human heart carries with it the capacity to connect back home.
Yeah.
Um,
Really well said. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think all of it's important. I would encourage people to practice in lineage. And then I would also encourage people that in their wild syncretic imaginings, there's potency and power there.
Yeah. Yeah, that speaks to me and my own sort of listless spiritual disposition a lot. The feeling like I'm not really quite sure where I belong, but I do have this insatiable sort of longing for something transcendent and something holy, and that's taken me down, you know, many paths. It's taken me on ayahuasca retreats and so many different things, like it has for so many other people. um I wanted to share this because when you mentioned this sort of postmodern spiritual gumbo and just uh, philosophical sense making issue in general, I'm sure you do too, but I often go to like a coffee shop or somewhere to edit or work on stuff, and one of them is also an art gallery, and there's an art school nearby, and I heard somebody use the phrase to refer to someone's art as postmodern, and I was just like, I don't think adding another post is gonna take you where you want to go. And of course, in the context of what they're talking about, I'm not quite sure. But in the context of this conversation, as you pointed to, I think you used the phrase of like the wound is so deep and the distance is so great. And that does not imply that you should remove your POV yet another post or add another, meta or whatever other word onto the most novel point of view possible. I think that there's a relinquishment that needs to occur. And I really like what you said about go into a practice even if you don't think it fully fits your, you know, intellectual disposition fully, because nothing really will, right? Like there really is nothing that ticks all the bases. Like you can't have a way of seeing that's both the most empirically rigorous and the most personally impactful. Like history has taught us that that is not like the way that we see the world is not the way we're going to find the world if we go around with ever more precise measuring devices, right? It's like you're literal the world is literally not the center of creation. um you are literally not the axis mundi of this world, and if you're running around trying to crunch numbers, you're not going to come to that conclusion. So there's a
Yeah.
different way of being that we have to find a way into through a different kind of thinking, and it requires like a relinquishment of that kind of knowing.
Yeah, I mean, part of the crisis of the Western world is that people need to practice more.
Yeah,
I mean, if you want to,
100%.
if you want to just like break it down simply, you know, worldview, in traditional systems, worldview isn't something that you just learn about as an abstract ideology and just kind of think about and like this kind of removed veil of symbols that you place upon the world. A philosophy is only as good or effective to the degree that it's actually embodied in practice. And so, you know, the um, the return to a type of like none of what we're looking for is going to be addressed through just adopting a different worldview or labeling something like post or
Yeah.
like, oh, I'm really on to something now. And so much of the discourse and debate these days is philosophical. It bears no resemblance to how like the person is actually practicing in their lives. So all of these, like, you kind of did a funny little Jordan Peterson impression and all this kind of stuff, like, you know, all of the kind of sense making, meaning making debate is only relevant if it actually translates into some type of embodied regular practice experience in the
Mhm.
person's life. Right now people are, getting very popular and making big sums of money simply talking about ideas, and it
Yeah.
all remains in the realm of ideas. All this kind of discourse around like, um, there's a new revival of uh, religiosity that's happening in like hipster circles in New York and this kind of thing. There's this kind of new masculine discourse that's happening, which
Yeah.
I'm going to do an episode about, which should be a wild ride, right? Like, but all of it is in the realm of ideas. It's not in the
Mhm.
realm of like, actually, how does this translate into how you're actually like, you know, practicing. And so what we need is like simple foundational somatic practice on a regular basis. Then we start to notice that worldview grows from that. Worldview ultimately grows from what we somatically do with our bodies regularly,
Yeah.
right? And we think it's the other way around. We think that worldview comes first and then like embodiment comes at. Actually, we are living expressions of the somatics that we embody. And understanding that, I think, helps place things in a little bit more perspective.
Definitely. Yeah. Speaking of simplicity, there is a quote that I pulled from that episode. In simplicity, there are great treasures that await.
Mm,
Um, and that was obviously in the context of talking about ritual and returning to simple practices over and over again. Also, though, before we get too far away from it, that syncretic conversation
mm,
is really interesting to me too, because for whatever reason, the flavor around that word and around that idea has really changed over time. Because you can see in the ancient world, like there was this Greco-Egyptian mishmash that they were happy to have happen, like that they're, like, oh, you're Hermes and our Thoth, this is like the same archetype. And there's like myths that sprout up around this being, and then like Hermes Trismegistus is likely born out of this. Like this is something you see throughout the ancient world, but now it's like there's this desire to take a scalpel and be like, no, this is not that, don't conflate these things. And sure, I think that there is some very important insight in not just like putting everything in this like soup of new age ideas. And I'm sure you're familiar with that whole Terrence McKenna riff about the separating the shit from shinola, and not creating some kind of relativistic, to use your word, gumbo of ideas where suddenly, um, you know, the idea of being a star seed is the same as somebody who like has a PhD in theoretical physics or something like that. Um, and yet there is some deeper truth behind the syncretic way of seeing. And I think that this is, where I immediately reach for people like Jung and Joseph Campbell, in that these symbols these archetypes are really just, and I don't mean just as a way to oversimplify it, but remember that these are images that are like straddling two worlds. Like a symbol, I think in I don't remember if it was Campbell quoting Jung or which direction it was, but essentially the idea that a symbol is something that's straddling two worlds, right? It's like
Mm,
it lives in like what Jung would call the mundus imaginalis in some real way, but it also is symbolized in this world using these different markers.
mm.
um and to me at least, it's exciting when I start to recognize like, aha, this marker transports to a similar um felt sense of mystery or archetypal truth or something. And yeah, I hope we can somehow get back to that instead of talking about these things in the context of like cultural appropriation and that kind of
Yeah,
shit.
well, and that requires what you could call an animate first way of talking about it. So, first off, what I mean by that is that there's a good reason right now why there is cultural appropriation discourse. There's a good reason why people are attempting to put up boundaries and walls around culture, and that has to do with cultural pillaging and like
Sure.
really like deep sacred traditions being, belittled and stolen and sold and watered down and marketed. And you can see this in Indian tradition a lot. You can see like many examples of it, right? So I think that there's a natural want to preserve, and you know, your average 200-hour yoga trainee, when they sit up in front of a class and start trying to expound the ancient wisdom of the ages, probably has very little idea of the actual roots of that tradition and may not really know much of what they're talking about. And that can rub people the wrong way. And I think there's a good reason that it rubs people the wrong way, right? I think there's an invitation to like, hey, if you're going to talk about this, like deepen into it and know what you're talking about, right?
Yeah.
Know what you're referencing and go deeper into it. And from a practice perspective, all of it's an invitation to not immediately have to be like a teacher, right? Like, hey, I took my, weekend shamanic workshop and
Mhm.
now I'm out here teaching shamanism to the masses and that kind of thing, when that traditional process might have taken 30 or 40 years, right? So I think all of that is deeply understandable. But then when it wants to silo everything into these kind of, permanent buckets of culture, that's where it starts to break down a little bit, because there is no tradition that is not syncretic.
Right.
I mean, Christianity was syncretic. Early Christianity drew
Oh
on
yeah.
Greek, Dionysian tradition, and it's incredibly present. And then the Catholic Church kind of came out against syncretism, but like the Catholic Church itself was an amalgamation of, saints who had been drawn from animate forces and like, Celtic traditional saints being absorbed into the Catholic pantheon and still being worshipped in really basically their old traditional animate ways. And that became part of Catholicism. And then, yeah, I mean, it's interesting when the Catholic Church in Brazil says, oh, these syncretic, Christian animist traditions, we don't approve of those. Well, the Catholic Church itself is incredibly syncretic, right?
Yeah.
Within India, I mean, India is syncretism. If you really understand the scope and scale and breadth and vastness of Indian tradition, you see local rural goddesses being appropriated into larger urban contexts, and then larger urban stories being reappropriated in village context, and the character from the Bollywood movie becomes a possessing entity in local culture. And new goddesses, like there's a recent case of a new goddess appearing and arriving in Andhra Pradesh, and new goddesses
Mm.
arrive all the time in this rural village level, and those new goddesses are meeting specific needs. So there's this like yes to the understanding that we need to respect and deepen, right? And then there's also this understanding that the animate itself, you could say, if we want to take this from the perspective of the animate itself,
Mm-hmm.
the animate, like any living species, reimagines, recapitulates itself, finds ways to express, like the creative force of the universe itself, finds people to reach who maybe it shouldn't have, like according to the strict rules. Like India is full of stories of like, oh, that person was from the wrong village and the wrong caste and wasn't supposed to have that visitation. And guess what? They had that visitation, and
Mm,
the animate came to that person and started moving through them. And you have to have a cultural capacity to recognize the potency and power of these animacies themselves. Otherwise, it's just a conversation about people, right? And
right.
that's not actually what the religious or spiritual conversation is. It's not just a conversation about people. It's about
Yeah.
how people create containers for what you're talking about, right? When you're talking about, archetype, which isn't a word that I use too often, but like I feel where what you're invoking with that. And like, the conversation isn't just, people create containers through which forces can move, and the creative needs of a culture are met, the healing needs of a culture are met, the interpersonal needs of a culture are met through their ability to adapt in their relationship with the ecology of spiritual forces around them,
Hmm.
if you know what I mean.
Oh, yeah.
So if ritual gets too uh, stodgy, if ritual gets too calcified, then it loses that ability to be a good vessel for the living forces that move through it. And this is the danger of saying, like, nope, this culture has to stay totally over here and this has to stay totally over here, and there's no bleed through possible, and you can't, have this next to this and that kind of thing. You lose the actual living creativity of, those forces themselves.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah, and another great way to do that, which you point out at length and in a very fun ride, is to try to colonize. I don't like overusing the word colonize, but capture that and the dynamicism and reality of that in psychological language, right? Which
Yeah.
is something that's become so prevalent
Yeah.
that it's funny that I'm re-listening to this episode yesterday. Um, I get an email. Maybe this is going to be too personal to share, but I get an email from a prospective guest. I'm going to say as little about them as possible while still trying to get this point across, who bills themselves as someone coming from a Buddhist tradition. I'll just leave it at that.
Mm.
And I go to their website and read their bio, and I'm not kidding, Josh. In the first line or two of the bio, it says, I'm not a psychologist or a therapist, but I do a lot of trauma informed work. And it just was perfectly illustrating the point that you make, among many points that you make in that episode, that psychology speak has infiltrated spirituality to a point where we can't discern between the two. And we try to wrap these spiritual thirsts and spiritual practices in psychological terminology. And I think the reasons for that are complex, and I won't launch into a ramble about why I think it is because I'd rather hear you riff on it. But how did you like? How did that come to you as an idea? Because it's a perfect idea for an episode.
I, you know, I mean, I saw over years that this was a pattern and a trend that was happening. And, um, you know, the James Hillman, who we've been speaking about a bit, had a wonderful quote where at that time he said, we psychologists need to rescue anima, not talking about the kind of masculine, feminine anima, but anima
Yeah.
as the breath of life. We have to rescue anima from the theologians, right?
Hmm.
And at that time, I think what he was talking about was deeply necessary, right? Like theology has gotten so dry and rituals gotten so, calcified, like I was talking about before, that the life breath is being threatened. So you saw this movement towards, like Jungian psychology and these types of things as a way to really celebrate that anima and
Yeah.
reconnect people to that anima. And, you know, now I would say maybe that anima needs to be rescued from the psychologists again.
Yeah.
And, like I said in the episode, like I grew up in a therapeutic environment. I have lots of good friends who are therapists. Everyone's doing the best that they can. And when I critique psychology, I think we have to develop our ability to understand that you can hold something and value it and also level some pretty serious critiques at it at the same time. And that's part of syncretism and multiplicity, right? Is to be able to
Yeah.
critique something without saying I'm like, um, some position in which I'm against this thing, right? It's about holding it and looking into its dynamics. The Greek mythology that a lot of the Jungian um, analysts built their fundamental worldview on was not saying that all of these forces live inside an individual's head.
Right.
That's not what Greek mythology like. So the appropriation of Greek mythology into the psychology world carries with it implications, and it's a beautiful way of starting to understand some of those forces that do, you could say, live within us. But
Yeah.
that was not by any means the full picture. The full picture is that we live in a world of forces and we're surrounded by forces, and there are internal forces and external forces. And not every single thing that happens in the world is a reflection of us. I
Yes.
hate to break it
Yeah.
down to, the modern Western individualist mind. Um, but something happens when we assume that everything is internal. And the first thing that happens is we are suddenly burdened with a whole lot of what you could call individual pressure. Like, everything that I might experience is mine and I own it. And it's a result of, maybe something that happened to me. And it's my job on an individual level, in a world where I'm already disconnected from the supports of community, already disconnected from ritual that could realign me to something greater, already disconnected from this great life breath. And now I, as an individual, am personally responsible for clearing myself of everything that is undoubtedly mine. The rage that moves through me is mine. The sadness that moves through me is mine. The everything has to have, in an individualized property ownership based world, everything has to have this quality of individual ownership to it.
Right.
And that is a recipe for some serious consequences, right, on the individual.
Yes.
Um, it's a burden on the individual. And the flip side of that, the aggrandizement of the individual, like the you know um the self-indulgence that's possible in a paradigm of, like, you know I'm going to sit here and talk about myself again, and now I'm going to sit here and talk about myself a little bit more. And I talk about in that episode, like, where I really see this facing in the next few years some potentially serious consequences, and is in the realm of the therapeutic application of psychedelics,
Yes.
where individuals will be taking these incredibly powerful consciousness amplifiers and assuming that everything that they're encountering in that field is about them,
Right.
that absolutely everything is about them, which could either crush a person or it could lift them up to heights that an individual shouldn't be placed on, right? It could either show you
Mhm.
that you're the most special thing in the world, or that you're an insect, right, that needs to be
Yes.
crushed. And neither of those things are the actual reality. The reality is we are relational and we live in relationship. And a person, something that arises within a person, isn't something that's necessarily originating from them or owned by them. When you understand that human beings are porous, if I take a drink of water and then, 10 minutes later, do I own that water? Well, that water is going to pass right through me. If I take a breath, do I own that breath? That breath is going to pass right through me.
Yeah.
Yes, we have patterns, and it's important to address those patterns. But a lot of the way that traditional cultures have dealt with patterns, and like what you could call trauma repatterning, isn't by isolating and extracting the thing and saying, here is the trauma pattern, and now I am going to transform it as this isolated, extracted thing. A lot of that repatterning has happened through communal ritual where it never even has to get named. You never
Yep.
even have to, if you're celebrating over 9 days the story of Demeter and her grief over her daughter's abduction into the underworld, and you're fasting for that 9 days, and you're singing the story, and that story contains within it the grief of a mother losing her child, and it contains within it that journey of that mother deep into the underworld to find Hecate and up into the sky to find Helios. And that story contains within it her sitting by the side of a well and singing her daughter's name. And that story contains within it her joyous reunion with her daughter too, right? It's going to take the person who practices that over that 9 days through an entire cycle of
Yes.
what we could call trauma repatterning without ever having to name it as like the thing, you know?
Yes.
And part of the problem I think we face is that we isolate everything as individual property and then try to deal with it on individual terms as individual isolated units.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
Alchemy works very differently than this.
Yes.
Alchemy, and I know that there's a lot of therapeutic systems that are not the old model of like, let's sit on a couch and talk about your parents kind of thing. Um, and I think these kind of new therapeutic models are wonderful because they're drawing on a lot more ancient wisdom. Um, but overall, I think there needs to be what you could call a recalibration of the individual towards its larger relationality. And fundamental to that is a deep question around what you could call source
Yes.
or divine or nature or time or the breath of life or however you want to describe it, right? Like the secularization of the world has brought with it benefits, and it's also brought with it consequences. And you know, when I said in that episode that I feel like there are 100,000 closeted devotional singers out there who are just
Yeah.
waiting to like drop to their knees and open up their arms to the greater flow of nature, it's like traditionally a lot of this stuff has moved through devotion.
Yes.
You know, you go
Yeah.
to a Southern Black church on Sunday and spirit starts moving, and um, that could move things that 20 years of therapy might not be able to move, right?
Yeah.
And therapy has its place too. But to see it as like an end into itself, I think we have to be careful of that.
Yeah, absolutely,
And I
man.
think we really need to reawaken and recalibrate our relationship, like I say in that episode, with the breath of life, with what could be called spirit, what could be called divine, goddess, God, what could be called nature, if that term God, goddess is not comfortable, what could be called the movement of time, the larger cycle, right?
Yeah.
Because ultimately, we are not isolated units. This unit will pass, within like 80 to 100 years, right? And what that time here is inviting us to is to open ourselves up to a larger relationality, or
Yes.
else the story of this existence gets very lonely very quick. Right?
It does, man. Josh, you just served me a platter of all of my favorite wonder nuggets right there. Like depth psychology, Jung, Hillman, Platonic Greek myth. You're alluding to like the mysteries, the Eleusinian mysteries with the story of Persephone and Demeter. This is just like an absolute burrito of all of my favorite things to riff on. And
Happy to serve the burrito.
yeah, the only question is where to bite in, and I guess
Mm,
to just like italicize your point that these psychologists, I mean, Jung and Hillman were obsessed with myth.
mm,
And you can really see this almost resistance to a lot of the modern torchbearers of depth psychology to really want to fully take it where I think Jung wanted it to go. Have you by chance read Catafalque by Kingsley, or know anything about it?
I have it at home and I haven't read it yet, but I've read Kingsley's other
Yeah.
work. And one thing, um, just to interject one
Yeah,
thing
yeah.
here quickly, one thing I feel about Jung, you know, Jung directly said that imaginal forces are real.
Mm-hmm,
You
mm-hmm.
know, Jung was not speaking as I feel into it and understand it. He wasn't speaking of the symbol as something that is just a placeholder for something else. He was speaking of it as alive and
Yeah.
animate. And
Yes.
I think that in the, you could call, natural modernization and westernization of Jung's work, I think without even knowing it, people have become distanced from that.
Mm-hmm.
Ultimately, what is being talked about when you talk about an archetype isn't a symbol for something abstract or something other or something, you know, dead. It's a living, breathing force.
Yes.
Kali, you know, Kali isn't a symbol for something else. Ka-
Right. Right.
the Divine Mother isn't a symbol for something else. Like there is a living, evolving, moving, creating, alchemizing, birthing, devouring animacy that is at play in the world, and it takes facets and forms. And like the fierce dark mother, for example, which has, you know, I talk about her quite a bit in this upcoming episode on syncretism. You know, every place that she's been pushed down, I hit my microphone there. I don't know if it sounded
It wasn't too
too
bad.
loud. Okay. Um, you know, start talking about the fierce dark mother, and my hands start waving, and
Yeah. It's
microphones start
understandable.
being hit. Yeah, every time she's been like pushed down, she's regrown in new facets and new
Right.
forms, and you can see this as Isis being reimagined as the Black Madonna, and you can see this in the rise and the popularity of the worship of Santa Muerte
Mm-hmm.
in Mexico. And you can see this in the Romani adoption of Saint Sarah, a Catholic saint, as Sarah La Kali, and the very, very Indian festival that they have around her in Europe. You can
Right.
see that, you know, you might call her Isis or the Black Madonna or Kali or Sarah in differing contexts, but what is at the heart of that is absolutely alive. It's
Right.
vital. It's not a symbol for something else. It's a facet of something living. So I think Jung was incredibly aware of this. Hillman was incredibly aware of this, you know, and Hillman talked directly about the psychologization, you know, even though he
Yeah.
was immersed in that world, he spoke about it.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Um, and so I think right at the heart of any discussion about, you know, Jungian psychology has to be the understanding that it itself has drifted somewhat from its original depth of understanding, which is an understanding of the living animate.
Yep. Yeah. Yeah. I think psychology became the, I'm not sure if it's like a Jacob's ladder going upward, but it's probably more like a like a catabasis into the underworld. Because if you part of Kingsley's big argument is that, well, and to put it in your terms too, you can really see this moment that Jung fell to his knees and called out for divinity in the Red Book. Like
Mm,
he like is crying out to his soul, asking where it is. And he calls this living deeper reality often the spirit of the depths. And Kingsley draws comparison between this spirit of the depths and the very real, like, psychic undercurrent of the underworld where, you know, daimons live, and the ancestors are alive. And when you go deep enough into the psyche, it's not like small p psyche anymore. It's like capital P psyche, where, you know, you could see it's almost, or to put it in also Jungian terms, like the personal unconscious becomes like the collective unconscious. and you kind of explode out into this the extant reality of the fractaling nature of psyche, and realize that there it is permeable and it doesn't end with you, and that you are connected to all of this on a much deeper, very real, non-symbolic level. The only place where where Kingsley really loses me is he seems to have this distaste for Plato that I don't really understand, because it's so clear to me that Jung was very heavily influenced by Plato, particularly the Timaeus, because he specifically says that and I've overshared this quote, but there's a quote in his collected works where he directly says archetypes are the Platonic eidos.
Mm,
So and then he brings it down into psychological terms, but he's not saying that's all they are. He's
mm,
saying for our purposes and for purposes of talking about psychology, they're psychological, but they're not just psychological. And I think that idea kind of grows um, as he ages. But anyway, yeah, this idea that this is very real and that it can't be completely captured in psychological terms, that in and of itself is really important. But it's also really important, and again, you do a great job of pointing this out, in the sense that it becomes the invisible subtext for the way that we think about spirituality.
mm,
As you point out, it's like infiltrated yoga, it's infiltrated Buddhism. And I have very close people to me in my own life that go to broadly, yoga sangha gatherings, and they complain about exactly what you're talking about, man, that it becomes
mm.
trauma dumping. It's like people sit in a circle and then they want to talk about their trauma, and it's like the memification, the psychological memification of spirituality or something. Um and that's like, I think, the real cash value of what's at stake here, is that we confuse the map for the territory. We begin to think that psychology is somehow truer or is somehow more representative of reality than these other ways of seeing, and then it nullifies the real power of those ways of seeing.
Yeah. You know, I had a conversation with Bio Okomolafe about it, and he and I have talked several times in this realm. And he says some really interesting things about, you know, the reification or the commitment to the creation of isolated subjects. And that, I think, is really important to look at. Like with all of what you're talking about, it becomes a question of like, what ultimately is the goal? What ultimately is the goal of existence? Like, what are human beings here for? What are we here to do? And it's almost impossible, in my view, to see that the kind of modern psychological or therapeutic system um, unconsciously recapitulates what you could call like an embedded Puritanism in it,
Mm.
in which we are continually in the process on an individual level of trying to extract the, you know, the evil thing, right? And trauma becomes like the evil thing. And if it's not the evil thing, then it becomes celebrated, and then it becomes weaponized, and then it
Yeah.
becomes like, my trauma is my excuse for why I get to do whatever I want in the world, but your trauma is the reason you're such a jerk.
Right. Yeah.
Right? Like, and this happens in cultural discourse, like very obviously and very readily. Um, and all of it kind of starts with this individualized lens that is assuming, I think, a individualized purpose to existence that I would say most traditional systems wouldn't share in exactly the same way. So, um, you know, the purpose of Buddhism ultimately is not what you would term a psychological purpose. It Buddhism dovetails nicely with certain understandings of individual psychology, because the Buddha was so beautifully focused on like, okay, in a crazy world. Like, here's what you can do with your
Yeah.
breath and with presence of mind. And like, it dovetails with that. But ultimately what the Buddha is speaking of is not a it's not a psychological journey. The journey of most of the spiritual traditions aren't what you could call a psychological journey. The um the process of being an animate relation that most indigenous and traditional cultures have put forward, it's different from what you could call the modern psychologized journey. It's different. It's not so much about the individual, and it's much more about the ecological. And it's also much more about the recognition of, again, greater forces. And, um, you know, the alchemy happens through the even flow within communal and ritual and ecological contexts between individuals and each other, communities and the larger ecology, ecologies and the cosmic, the individual and the cosmic and the communal. All of these are interflowing in a way that can't be touched or done justice to if your primary way of seeing things is about the purpose of individual existence to be simply to um, tackle something internally. And
Yep.
if we work with it just internally, we're not addressing, you know, 90% of what we actually are, which is who we are in relation. So, yeah, it reinforces all of the, it's funny because it's supposedly kind of counteracting, like, the forces of modernity. But it's reinforcing all of the worst aspects of individual modernity. It's
Yes.
reinforcing, you know, it's reinforcing an isolated individualism. It's reinforcing a puritanism in many ways. Um, and it's also just like the death of poetic discourse. Like,
Yeah.
the way that the kind of psychological terminology has become a way for people to like castigate other people or judge other people, or you know like the terms through which something they say is deemed valid or not, like has to do with like the liberty with which people feel to like psychoanalyze each other publicly and this kind of thing. I don't have any interest in that kind of discourse whatsoever because I don't see any traditional system resort to that.
Yeah.
I think it's a very modern phenomena, and like I say at the end of that episode, like give me a capoeira circle, give me a old school hip hop battle, like
Yeah.
give me a form of discourse that can like work to express grievance, but isn't so charged with kind of, you could say,
Yeah.
like
Yeah. Yeah.
Puritan castigation, like I am going to decide that you are ultimately less than me, you know or I'm going to psychoanalyze everything that you're saying and then use that as a way to like get at you. It's it's kind of like the dynamics of the struggle session as opposed to the dynamics of like the actual communal circle. So
Yeah, man.
yeah.
Yeah, and I wrote part of that down, a reminder to talk to you about this exact thing, because what you're pointing to here is multiple things, but one of them is that there are these ritualistic containers that are almost like these places where these takedown style cathartic rituals take place, like again capoeira or rap battles or whatever it is, and you understand implicitly that you're entering into the place where you do the dance battle or you do the rap battle. But what people don't understand, and it's kind of fucking terrifying when you think about it, that when you're entering that mode of thinking about yourself and using all of these psychological terms, it's like you're entering this invisible circle, this like self-referential invisible circle, and you're in this mode of being and thinking about yourself. But that too is like a place that you chose to enter and a way to think about yourself and language you're choosing. And it's terrifying to think that for many people, and of course I'm guilty and I have my own blind spots as well. I'm not trying to say I don't, of course, but that so many people are operating as if like that's represented, like this is the ground floor of reality. And it's not like some thing that we invented using terminology. That's,
Yeah, the speed with which it's been adopted is just kind of the way things are, is part of the impetus behind releasing that episode.
yeah,
Because, you know, I'm old enough to remember a time when I was, in the early 90s, you saw like the seeds of this kind of discourse, and now you see the full blown realization of it. And um, the lack of understanding of its own lack of neutrality is troubling. Is troubling, and it's not a neutral ground on which to stand. It's a particular worldview, and that particular worldview, um, you know, is fairly embedded in the dynamics of modern humanist Puritan culture, and may not see itself as such. Yeah, I'm working on an episode. I don't know when it's going to come, but I'm working on an episode on how Puritanism extends through a lot of continues to extend through a lot of modern social movements and social discourse, even the ones that the last thing they would think of themselves as is Puritan. And
right.
I think it's a really important inquiry into how culture rehashes and recapitulates itself. And all that being said, like everyone I feel ultimately is doing the best they can, and everyone is trying, and I'm doing the best I can. You're doing the best you can. People are trying, and like the rise of this type of work has been because, you know, individual traumas, you could say, had been so repressed for so long that they needed to be dug up and honored and
Yeah.
dealt with. And, there's incredibly positive aspects to that too. Um, but we can't forget the breath of life. And
Yes.
we can't forget that it's not just the story isn't just about us, right?
Yeah, man. Yeah.
And ultimately, all of this, any tradition, um, any way to, any filter through which we understand reality, any mandala prism through which we relate to the larger world, is so that we can come in better, deeper, respectful, loving relation with one another,
Yes.
right? And this is where avoiding weaponization is important.
So
Like
important. Yes.
any lingo can be used to any vernacular prism or framework can be used to resort to very easy dynamics of putting other people down and putting oneself up.
Yes.
It's not hard to do, right? And we have to have awareness of how any system can function in that way if it's not handled with care and respect and love.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, both sides of the political aisle are constantly using it to bully the other side. And I don't want to I don't want to stay in this sort of like pejorative, vein of the conversation, because one of the things that
Mm,
you do such a good job of in your show is capturing the flip side, which is the beauty that's right there for you if you're willing to go into the, for lack of a better term, that beautiful simplicity that you allude to, that embodied ritualistic way of
mm,
being that you talk about. And how good it feels really to put your ego down, to turn the frontal lobe off, through whatever your practice is, drum circle dancing, meditation, psychedelics, whatever it is. And there's no amount of talking about, reading about, intellectualizing that will ever yield the same catharsis that those experiences do. So I want to emphasize
Yeah.
that's what you're getting at. You're not seeking to like belittle psychology through this conversation, um, but just really drive home that it is not the same thing as the practice.
Hmm. Yeah. I mean, you know, from where I sit, and this is from someone who's practiced in devotional tradition for a number of years of my life, the most interesting, fascinating thing about the world is the ever creative wellspring of animacy that we were talking about at the beginning of this discussion, and how it moves and how it shifts and how it changes and what it is and how it reflects in communal bodies and how it reflects in individual bodies. And that is much more interesting than, um, the overemphasis on individual process.
Yeah.
Individual process is deeply important, but individual process sometimes is served better by understanding how to reconnect to that, than it is treated as its own isolated, separate thing. And that's really the heart of it. Um, People are processing because they need to process. Something needs to move, something needs to alchemize. What I'm hoping to invite is an exploration of what allows that magic, that alchemy to happen. And yeah, I'm not, interested in bashing psychological systems. Critique is different than bashing. But what I'm ultimately interested in opening us up to, helping to open us up to, is like what really does move things, what really does change things, what really does alchemize things. And a lot of time we can put a lot of years and a lot of effort into trying to do it all ourselves, when there is a living, breathing force that moves through nature, an alchemizing force, a transformative force, the same force that creates the discomfort in the um, cocoon that allows the butterfly to spring forth,
Yeah.
the same force that in the friction of its womb spaces births stars, right? The same force that is with us every time we inhale and we exhale. And understanding what it means to align to it more is to open ourselves up to an alchemy that might not be possible if all the emphasis is on us.
Yeah. Yeah, you use that term alchemy a lot, and I do too. Like it's a phrase that I think I overuse sometimes, and I worry that I'm like, is it coming across what I mean when I'm talking about this? And I think the thing that's at the core of my worry is, do people understand what it is that's going from prima materia to rubedo? And I'm wondering how you think about that. Like what is it that you think is changing, evolving, uh, burning off in that personal process?
Hmm. Um, you know, with this, I'm not going to marry myself to one particular worldview. Um, we live in a universe of harmonic resonances, right? Like there is a resonance underlying all of this, and this is
Yeah.
true from a purely quantum physics perspective, just as it's true increasingly from what biological scientists are saying about evolutionary mechanisms and resonance and this type of thing.
Yeah.
um, Communities are built around this resonance. uh, the ability to perceive it and to attune to it has been what has allowed cultures to survive over deep time, um, and has allowed individuals within those cultures to thrive in relation with one another. Um, there's a resonance in, the ritual drumming that has underpinned so much cultural activity, the ritual dancing, the ritual singing that has underpinned so much cultural activity. These are ways of, you could say, alchemizing. They're ways of transforming things that need to be transformed. And what I mean by that is getting rid of the agitated static that keeps us from
Mm.
being able to attune to the voice of the world and live in resonance with it, right?
Yes, yes.
Um, so attunement is something that for human beings takes alchemy. It takes a traverse of some kind. We don't just snap our fingers and we feel perfectly in sync and in flow, right? There needs to be a practice that gets us there, right? And so the alchemy is to take us from our, normal, quote unquote, waking state of consciousness, in which we're going about our day and doing our business, to alchemize something that then allows us to find a deeper connectivity and attunement.
Yeah.
Um, Over time, as repatterning happens, the amount of static interference between us and that attunement melts away a little bit, and that's alchemy, right? So you can talk about it in terms of traumas, as some systems have. You can talk about it in terms of vritti thought patterns,
Yeah, yeah.
as some systems have. Um, but the ancient understanding that when you heat something up, it starts to flow and liquefy a little bit more, right? Like we exist in kind of the our, again, normal waking state, and in that normal waking state, there's jagged edges and agitations and separations and you know states of what you could call harmonic dissonance between us and others and us and the natural environment around us. And as we heat things up, and that can be done through singing, it can be done through dancing, it can be done through prayer, it can be done through meditation, though I feel that meditation always needs some somatic component to it. It can't just be like sit down and be quiet. I think it has to have some type of invocation or something, because that's how it's traditionally practiced. It can be many, many, many different ways. It can be like running up a hill. It can be whatever that daily practice or regular practice of heating is.
Hmm, hmm, hmm.
Tapas in the Indian traditions, that
Yeah.
heating up, that takes us into a state where things flow a little bit more easily, and we can rediscover that attunement to um, the harmonic interaction between us and community and ecology a lot more easily. But it has to be practiced and it has to be felt. And as you practice it over time, the dross, you could say, becomes less. It
Hmm,
does.
hmm.
Like you become more able to slip more easily into those spaces of attunement. And in those spaces of attunement, visions can be had of what's to come. Problems that are at play within the culture and the community can be dealt with. Our ethical relationship with the larger world can be reinforced. All of these things happen in that alchemizing state of flow, right? In that place of direct experience of connection, interconnection between myself and the world around me. So I feel like that's what's being burned off as we
Hmm.
alchemize, is the static that keeps us from being able to hear and attune to the song of the world.
Really well said. Yeah, and it's isn't it interesting that throughout so many different traditions, there seems to be like it is equated with heating, and I think even I want to say the Greek word catharsis means something like burning off,
Mm,
something like a burning off release, like gaseous release of something, so that you can exist in a more harmonious mode of being. And that's something that actually it seems like escapes a lot of people. A lot of Plato's teachings are built around harmonic principles. Like the Timaeus is one famous example. Like if you're, you're reading this strange myth about how the demiurge created the cosmos, everything is proportioned in harmonic terms. Like they'll just hit you with these big long, strings of ratios, and then you come to find out, if you look into it, it's like, oh, this is the musical scale. And there's actually new academic research on the Republic arguing that the Republic is also structured the exact same way, that it's all built on nodes of harmony, and at each key point in the musical scale, there's some direct, like, slap in the face reference to harmony. Like one of them is the divided line analogy, and it's like, oh well, what's the divided line? It's a golden ratio. It's another harmonic mathematical proportion.
Mm.
And yeah, so I think that there is this, not even syncretic, but like perennial philosophy, some kind of like pristine Prisca Sophia that runs through all these traditions that seem to understand that they're that. And Plotinus would talk about this too. This idea, he called it stains that need to be burned away, I believe. And that, like, if you want to have a vision of what you're talking about, you have to remove yourself from sensory input for an extended period of time to burn off the stains, I believe is the terminology he used. So yeah, it's interesting how this burning, whether
Mm.
it's alchemy, yoga, Platonic, Greek mysticism, that we don't fully understand what they were doing anymore, but seems to be contemplative or maybe psychedelic or both. Yeah, they
Yeah.
all seem to use that word, burning.
Yeah. And I'll just offer that they're using it not symbolically. And it's a basic alchemic understanding that you actually heat something up, and that's
Yeah.
when things exist in a greater state of flow. So, literally, like the sweat lodge ceremony,
Oh
you
yeah.
heat yourself up, right? The yogic practice is described in terms of heat. The fire sacrifice, the reason that there is fire at the center of so many shrines and altars and so many ritual practices, the heating up aspect is present everywhere. And it's present because, if you want things to, if you want food ingredients to transform, you cook them. You put them in a cauldron and you put them over fire and you put them in water and you cook them, right? This is, if you want to change anything, you cook
Yeah.
it. If I'm having a, really hard time, like with waves of agitated thought, I know that if I go for a hike in the woods until things start heating up and I start sweating, that as soon as I start sweating, things are going to start moving. I know that. That's alchemy. That's literally the process of heating something up. I know I grew up as a teenager doing sweat lodge ritual in the Lakota tradition. And I know how it would take my day-to-day waking consciousness and what it would do to it in that incubator, and what the heat and the steam and the fire and the water actually do. So it's not a metaphor, right? The heating up. The practices have involved heat of some kind, and the entire Indian tradition is built on what's called tapas, which is the understanding that the universe itself was created through a great heating, and that
Mm.
fire pervades the universe, and that if we want to connect to that primal fire, that we need to heat ourselves up in some way. And then when we heat ourselves up, things flow. Gold melts, things liquefy, and in that liquid state there's an outpouring possible, and there's a
Yeah.
there's a harmonic resonance possible. And one of the things that is interesting in modern physics, Carlo Rovelli's book The Order of Time, more and more, there's a basically emerging theory of time, because physicists have had a really hard time, like, actually, explaining what actually moves to create the difference between past, present, and future. And more the understanding is that it's heat, that
Mm.
time and heat are synonymous. So those yogic, Vedic, tantric teachings of Kalagni, the fire of time, right, as the nature of creation, are talking about something actual, that this is a universe in which heat is transferred, and like Heraclitus said, everything in
Yes.
flame.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
everything inflames according to its measure and dies out according to its measure, and this is the functioning of the eternal world breath, right?
Yep. Yep.
It's a world of heat, and we heat ourselves up to connect to that primal fire. And in heating ourselves up to connect to that primal fire, the things that need to burn off can be burned off. Uh,
Yeah.
but
So
again,
interesting. Yeah.
but again, it's not the same thing as it's communal, it's ecological. It's not just an individual process. It's not a theoretical process. It's something that has to be done together because, you know, if I um, if I have some issue or dissonance with a certain member of the community, and then we're put in a position where we have to keep the dance step going for 6 hours or 8 hours together, and we're close enough in a close enough circle that if anyone breaks that step, it's going to affect the overall ritual efficacy, right? I'm completely dependent upon that other person, and that person is completely dependent upon me. So the heating up process is not just so that I can achieve some kind of individual state of being like trauma free. The heating up process is so that we as a community can forge our bonds of relationality in resonance with one another. And that communal functioning, that ethical interplay, can be in good relation to the forces of nature around us. And
Yeah,
that's the
man.
heart of it. That's the heart of it. You know, I don't have to be in this lifetime a perfect person. I can't snap my fingers and be a quote unquote perfect person, whatever that is. You know, what I can do is go through this alchemic process with you, with each other, in relation, so that we together can start to embody a system that is a deeper reflection of that harmony around us.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Man, that is a great mic drop right there. I think there's a couple other interesting fire things I want to just like throw into the conversation and throw into the cauldron
There
because
is a fire episode coming too.
oh, fantastic,
Yeah.
fantastic. Well, you picked the Heraclitus one out of my mind because I remember that there were
Mhm.
certain pre-Socratic philosophers that believed that fire was like the primordial element, and like they had different arguments about that. But um, two things that have perplexed me and interested me so much is that if you read this like Gnostic esoteric part of Jung's Red Book that he calls Seven Sermons to the Dead, that he originally published under the pseudonym of Basilides of Alexandria, he equates the Principium Individuationis, which later becomes individuation. He says the ultimate end for these beings that complete this process is to become a star, which is a flaming body, right? And trying to figure out what that means is fantastically vexing and interesting. But I have found like Platonic tie-ins, like in the Timaeus, they talk about that when the individual soul is created in a cauldron, of course, um, there's a corresponding star. So that's one
Mm,
interesting element. Another interesting element is Proclus, who's we have a ton of writing from because he's one of the later Platonist sages who ended up running the revived academy for a time. Is he says that the philosopher needs to build a noetic body of fire, and
mm,
like by building this like noetic body of fire you attain some kind of immortality. And again, this sounds so similar, yet I'm not quite sure what it means, but I find it just supremely interesting.
mm. Yeah. I mean, when you get to the subatomic level, and what you find are quivering luminosities, this whole universe is a dance of fire. Right? There's a great fire to creation. There's a great fire at play. Mm. The quivering luminosities within space. And the journey, there's a yogic story that I've always loved, which is there's a particular sage who practices his inner heat, practices his tapas, his alchemy over years and years and years and years and years and years and years. And he's feeling pretty good about it. He's feeling like, like he's gotten somewhere. Feels this just vital energy moving through his body. So he's interested to see what's going on in there. So he takes a knife and he cuts open his arm.
Ooh.
And as he cuts open his arm, this crystalline, purified sap just pours out. Like he's done so much inner heat that he's like transmuted his blood into this crystal clear sap like liquid. And then he gets really excited and he starts going around and showing everybody, hey, look what I've done. Like, look at the result of my, years of practicing heat. There's another sadhu under the tree nearby and just starts laughing. And so the first sage goes over to the other sadhu and is like, why are you laughing? And the other sadhu like rolls up his sleeve and takes a knife and cuts open his arm, and ashes pour out. Ashes pour out. And, it's said that second sadhu is Shiva himself, coming to show that, ultimately the connection to that inner fire, like ultimately it's an ashes to ashes kind of thing. Ultimately it's an obliteration of what we've known before.
Right. Yeah.
And this is like part of the issue, I think. Everything we do these days is so conflated with this sense of individual achievement that even the why am I ridding myself of my patterns? Why am I undertaking the work of trying to be like ultimately trauma free? And it's so bound up with like, oh, when I achieve the mystical state of wellness, or when I achieve that far off place of being trauma free, then what? My blood is going to flow like sap, and I'll be able to sell it by the ounce on the internet, and my career will start going really well, and I'll get recognition. Like, where does it ultimately all lead? Ultimately, where it leads in this story anyway is to ashes, and the burning of what we call ourselves away completely. And that's something that gets missed in the modern alchemic discourse, that the alchemy is not to take us to this place of, like, wellness influencer status.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
The alchemy is a kind of self obliteration. And, ultimately when I hear you talking about like, us becoming like, a star and this kind of thing, like, I think of the recent conversations I've been having with a particular Aboriginal elder named Noel Nanup. And, the journey for humans, and this is really how we started this conversation out, the journey for human beings is to embody the law of the cosmos around us. It's to be in greater alignment with a living, breathing law of the cosmos, which means an alignment to the communal and to the ecological and to the cosmic and to the mystery that's driving it all. It's not about like what one person can achieve through their alchemic journey. It's about opening ourselves up to a greater movement. And if we open ourselves up to it, we find that it is ever nourishing, ever replenishing, ever embracing, because it's love. It's love itself. Love not as an abstract, not as like I, as an individual, am going to get to the place of cosmic divine non duality love by myself. No, but love as expressed in community, as expressed in ritual structures, as expressed in ecology, right? It's about establishing all of those intermediary relationships, right? So that I can be a part of that great humming resonance.
So well said, man. This has been so much fun. Has
Yeah.
been absolutely nourishing. Thanks so much for doing it. Would love to do it again.
Yeah, I'm gonna
Um,
have to read up on my Plato to talk more about Plato, but my sense with all of the Greek philosophy, I mean, Plato is teeming with animacy and spirit
oh yeah,
possession and all of these things. And my general sense with all of the Greek philosophers is that they get so vastly taken out of conduct and misunderstood because
yeah,
people do not have the understanding that these folks were also practicing direct embodiments of religious practice and animate forces entering them and taking them over and all this kind of thing. And uh you know so it gets viewed as a kind of abstract philosophy when in fact it was not that.
100%, man. Like
Yeah.
we didn't even talk about theomania, like divine madness.
Mhm.
That's right in the Phaedrus. Like Socrates is talking about, like, one of the greatest gifts
Yeah.
from the gods is when they make you go mad. You know,
Yeah.
like
and
that.
mad and mad is
Yeah,
perhaps not the right translation.
yeah.
Have you read Yulia Ustanova's book Alteration of Consciousness in Ancient Greece?
I have not.
You got to read that one.
That sounds awesome.
Yeah, it's she's basically saying because of the mistranslation of enthusiasm and mania, we've gotten the
Mm,
entirely wrong picture of what was actually going on in ancient Greece. And she goes through how the entire culture was driven by consciousness alteration and trance states, basically.
yeah,
Um,
I'm very, my ears are very open to that. I love
yeah,
that.